And welcome to another episode of Chords and Conversations. I'm Chris Hludzik.
And I'm Bryan Brophy.
And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing how to put an album together. So, in a previous episode, we talked about the songwriting process and demoing songs, writing songs. Now we're actually going to talk about how you take those songs and put them together in either an album or an EP, just how you put them together in a project. So Bryan and I have both been involved in various projects over the years, so I'm sure we've got some different and some similar perspectives on this. So Bryan, why don't you go first? How do you construct an album?
Every album that I have ever put together, I have done it in a different way. So if we look at my first album, When Words Speak Louder Than Actions, a lot of that album was just songs that I had written that I recorded, and I really didn't have an idea of a certain order, but I knew that certain songs would go better in the beginning or at the end of the album. So I already had a bunch of songs already prepared for the album. And then when I wrote Playing with Matches, I wrote it in such a way that it could be an album opener. So if you are familiar with that album, it kind of has almost like a fanfare kind of opening with just the piano. And then there are some like louder hits on the guitars and things like that before the whole song comes in, almost like an instrumental introduction to the album, even though the introduction is to the song itself. So it kind of served both purposes. And it's the only song on the album that has that kind of big opening to it. So I chose that as the opening song for the album. And I'm old school. I really like the idea of having a side one and a side two. And when I wrote that album, even though I really didn't have a certain way when I was writing the songs, I knew that I wanted a side one and side two, but I also like the idea of side one and side two having different moods. So after the first few songs, it comes in with The Promise, which kind of has a little bit more of a darker tone. And even The Promise has almost like an introduction type of feel to it, but it's in a minor key, it's a little bit darker. And the rest of the album carries kind of a darker theme to it. A lot of the songs are in minor, there's some drop D stuff on there that wasn't on the first half of the album. So for that album, the first half of the album was poppy, upbeat, and then the second half of the album is a little bit darker, even lyrically, even though everything on the album was very angsty at the time. And I always like to kind of leave the person with a nice little pretty piano ballad at the very end. That's really how I like to construct an album. I kind of like having that side A, side B, but also having a switch of moods. And I always like to have the side A be the more upbeat, more poppy stuff, because that's what people are going to want to hear first. They're going to want the feel-good songs and the songs that you're going to tap your feet to. They're going to want to hear, the songs that kind of resonate with them, making them feel good and everything before we get dark and deep with the second half of the album. And I also think that in this day and age, everybody is so ADD. If they don't get through the whole album, they're at least going to hear all the poppy stuff and the stuff that makes them happy. Then when I go to that side B, that's when I get a little bit more pensive, a little bit more reflective with my lyric writing, with the music in general. The second full-length album I did was similar, and it wasn't so much a side A and side B, but I did save the heavier material for the second half of the album. And then the acoustic album, when I was recording it, I really didn't have a plan for that, and you actually helped me come up with a lineup of songs. But anymore, when I write an album, I will sit down and I will write an album. I will write the first song first, I will write the second song second. This album that I'm working on now, I very much put into the writing a flow. Not only just with lyrics, but a flow with the music. So the beginning and ending chords of the songs will run into each other, like the songs are their own chord changes themselves. And that's something that I've never done before. Now, with my more acoustic-y Bryan Brophy solo music, I'm back to kind of square one, just writing songs. Whatever comes out, and then I'll deal with the process of putting the album together. What songs are going to make it on the album, what songs are not going to make it on the album. And I still don't even have fleshed out whether it's going to be an acoustic or eventually be a full band album. This is just kind of more feel-good songs, songs from the heart, songs from the soul, without any gimmicks or genre, or whatever comes out at this point for me.
I'm glad you mentioned the whole side A, side B philosophy, because that is pretty much how I've always viewed albums. And it's harder this day and age to view albums that way because digital downloads and streaming are a big thing now. Obviously, vinyl records still exist, and cassettes to some extent still do exist, very limited runs that some bands will do. But I grew up with cassettes. And cassettes have side 1 and side 2, just like a record does. And if it was a double record, you had 4 sides,
Yeah.
But the important thing is, whether it's a single album, a double album, whatever, or if it's just you're listening to an album just in one pass as a digital download or a stream that you're listening to online, flow is the most important thing. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in my mind, I kind of have a formula for that, and it varies from album to album. For instance, my very first album was called Yours in Rock, and as the title implied, it's a rock album. So I open it up with a rock song, Live. It was a really good album opener because it kind of had a slow start, chord slashes, you're keeping time on the hi-hat.
The cymbal and the hi-hat, yeah.
And then everything kind of builds up, the drums start kicking in a little more, the guitars get heavier, and then the song comes in.
And it just kicks you in the chest.
It's a really great way to come into the album. And then I follow that up with another really heavy song, Leave It at Home. Then I go to a poppy song, Insomnia. Mm-hmm. Then I go to a darker song with Negative Space, which is an acoustic song. And then I kind of bring it up again a little bit with a darker song, but still a rocker, with Friend. And then that's side 1, effectively, of that album. Side 2 opens up with a poppy number, Sleep Forever. And then after Sleep Forever is Big Damn Deal, which is a nice rocker. Then after Big Damn Deal is What Good, which is another really kicky in the face rocker. Then after What Good is this nice slow acoustic number, the instrumental, Grain of Sand. And then after Grain of Sand, we close it off with a nice softer acoustic and piano ballad with All Amped Up. And it's a nice close to the album. That album was mainly all of the songs that I had at that point in time that I felt were good enough to be on an album. A lot of people say your first album's the easiest to make because you had all your life to write it. But for me, it was kind of difficult because I wanted to make a good impression with the first album. I didn't want to have that first album that's like, well, it's not as good, but hey, it was my first album. I hate when bands do that. They diss their first albums. Because a lot of bands' first albums, like, okay, maybe they're not as good as they would become, but would you expect it to be? It's their first album, you know what I mean? I don't think people are going to listen to somebody's first album and expect it to be amazing right off the bat. But the point is, even though it was just a collection of songs that I'd had up to that point and there was no concept to it, I put the songs together in such a way that it had a flow. So it didn't matter that none of the songs connected lyrically or thematically. They connected musically pretty well because you start off with a strong number, you get another strong number, it slows down a little bit, then it goes down a little bit again, it comes up a little bit. I kind of equate it to like waves. You're riding a wave, and the wave kind of recedes a little bit. Then it comes back up again, then it recedes a little bit. But that was how I put together Yours in Rock, my first album. Now, my second album, Dissonance Meets Harmony, was a little different. It did have a theme. It did have a motif to it. I did want the music to reflect something specific. So that was a little different because I had originally 10 or 11 songs in contention for that album. I only ended up using 8 of them. Because there were a couple songs that, well, one was a little too similar to another song that was already on there that I really liked a little more than that other song. And then there was another song that was a good song, but didn't really fit in with the motif. So I had to kind of figure out what was going to work better. But again, it all came down to flow. And again, this was a more kind of a, for lack of a better term, singer-songwriter type album. The songs were more inward looking, more somber, slower. There were a few rockers on it. But even the rockers weren't as in your face as the stuff on Yours in Rock was. So there was a little bit more nuance to it. There was a little bit more dynamic. It wasn't as meat and potatoes as the first album. Mm-hmm. But again, flow is the main thing. And the side A, side B correlation is so important. And any young musicians listening to our podcast right now, I implore you, if you've never listened to a vinyl record, if you've never listened to a cassette, try to listen to one. Maybe your parents have them laying around, or your grandparents or something. And sit and listen to an album. Listen to side A, listen to side B. See how the songs flow. See how a side of an album starts. See how it ends. Usually the albums are kind of done, like Bryan said, in halves. There'll be one half that maybe is a little more upbeat. The other half might be a little more downbeat. One half might be faster. One half might be slower, more mid-tempo. And it was the way they had to do it back then physically, because that was what the medium dictated back then. You know, on a vinyl record, you could only fit maybe 5 or 6 songs on a side. You couldn't really go over 22 minutes before it started to sound like crap, because the groove would get smaller. So it was more for mechanical reasons than musical reasons, but I always found it was better because of the fact they only had 22 minutes for a side. They had to put like the best 22 minutes they could on that side. And I think that's something that we lost starting with the CD generation, because now all of a sudden, we could do 74 minutes of music. And then it was 80 minutes of music they expanded it to on a CD. Now with digital downloads, I mean, you could upload like 10 hours of music and call it an album, which is ridiculous. To me, an album will always be like anywhere between like 30-some minutes to 45 minutes, maybe a little less than 30 minutes, as long as it has a flow and as long as there's a break in between. With our most recent album, the Latter Days' second album, Matters of Time, that was configured side A, side B. And what Bryan said about sometimes on the first side of an album, what a lot of bands would do, it was called front-loading an album. You'd put all the hits or all the more poppy stuff or potential hits on the first half of the album. And the second half of the album might be reserved for the longer songs, the more unconventional songs, or whatever. I think that's a good way to do it, and especially because of the reason Bryan said, because attention span is so non-existent nowadays, especially in the days of digital streaming, that if you could at least get through the first couple songs, well, you at least got the bulk of what that musician was maybe trying to get across.
I feel like the second side, or going deeper into the album, is kind of like getting more deeper into the soul of the artist as well. You know, like all the surface stuff is what kind of catches you. So like you put it on and all the poppy, happy stuff starts. And then the more you get to know the artist, like let's dig a little deeper into the soul and see what's there. That's kind of how I see it.
But there's so many different ways you could do it. And there's really no right or wrong way. But I think as long as you have some kind of way in your head of how you want to put these songs together, it's better than just kind of saying, oh, well, I've got 10 songs. Well, I'll just throw them on, however, because it needs to have something. There needs to be something that the listener can kind of hang on to. If there's not a theme or a motif or a concept, they at least need to be able to kind of go on a ride at least. You're not kind of jerking the listener around. You're taking them on a trip. I think that's important. And again, I think it's something that's kind of lost in the digital era.
Yeah, and I think, too, like, even if an album isn't supposedly a concept album, I think it's really important that when the songs flow, the listener can formulate some kind of story. Every time I put an album together, I always try to make a story out of it. And I noticed that a lot of albums from artists that I listen to, you could kind of come up with a story for them, even if that's not what was intended. But just that flow gives your brain that feeling, like your brain needs for everything to make sense.
Right.
Or else your brain is not going to like it.
You need to be able to connect with it somehow.
Yes.
Whether if it's musically, lyrically, there's got to be something to hang on to, like I said. So we talked about albums. Now, what would you do in terms of something shorter? If you just wanted to release, a single, or if you wanted to do an EP?
So for me, right now I have on my Bryan Brophy Music Bandcamp, I have a song called Maddie's Song. And that is kind of like the first single that I came out with when I wanted to do something a little different with the singer-songwriter type of music, because I was doing these heavy, pop-punk bangers and stuff like that. And I'm still working on that stuff, but I'm getting older now. It kind of hurts to scream anymore and stuff like that. So I'm looking for a different avenue, something that I can sing when I'm, 45, 50 years old and I still want to do music. I don't want to, kill my voice or kill my chops or anything. So I picked Maddie's Song, not so much because I wanted that to be the single, but because that was the song when I played an original show, everybody commented that they liked the best. And that actually was not supposed to be the first song that I was going to release to show people this new stuff that I was doing. Mm-hmm. I was going to pick a completely different song, but after that show, I got so much praise over that one song. And they're like, don't get me wrong, these other songs are great too, but oh my gosh, that song that you wrote about your daughter was just so sweet, and I have a little girl at home, and it reminds me of, whatever it reminds you of. And that's when I decided that was going to be the first song that I was going to put out.
I mean, that's another good point you bring up about being able to play songs out live before you record them or release them, because it kind of gives you an opportunity to see what works and what doesn't. So again, like you said, you had no intention of releasing that song as a single, but because of the feedback that you got from people in a live setting, it changed your mind and it completely changed the path of, what you were going to release. And I think that's always an advantage, if you can play the stuff out live before you release it, because that's another good way to kind of weed out songs that maybe don't work or maybe still need a little work. And I'll give you an example. I played out for over a year before I released my first album. So I had over a year of playing those songs and others to see which ones I liked, which ones were going to work. And that really helped me formulate the track list for that first album and a little bit for the second album, because I was already, writing songs for that second album. And again, some of them might have in another world ended up on that first album, but again, didn't fit. It was a different direction. So I held them back. Another thing that really helped me was I played an open mic one time, and I played a song called The Thanks I Get. And you were there. It was when we were at the Judge and Jury in Scranton.
They were the good times.
Yeah. And I played this song called The Thanks I Get, and it's on my second album. In its original form, it didn't have a bridge, and it just kind of ended after the second chorus. And after I ended the song, everybody kind of looked at me like, where's the rest of it? And so then I knew I had to go back. I was like, all right, this needs a little more. So for any young bands, young musicians listening, it's always a good idea to be able to play your stuff to an audience, road test it, as they call it in the business, so that when you do go to record, you'll know what's going to work. You'll know what needs more work. You'll know what you could hold back. You'll know what you can put out.
Yeah, and I know for me, when I recorded my first album, I did not road test any of those songs because I was not playing out as a singer-songwriter, playing my original music. But after that, I did road test a lot of my stuff, and I road tested it in such a way like, what songs did I have the most fun playing? And that kind of made me realize, oh, well, that's this one. This one should be here. This one should be the first song on the album.
Track listings on an album are so important. Again, just going back to the flow of things. I don't know if a lot of the bands and stuff you listen to had different track listings on their albums overseas as opposed to here in America. But some of the bands that I listen to, like, songs will be mixed up on the album version from the UK as opposed to the version we get here in the US. And it makes a completely different album. Even though it's the same songs, the same mixes and everything, just listening to it in a different order, it's like, man, this is a different feeling. This is a different vibe. But it just goes to show that flow is so important, and it really changes the vibe of an album. And again, I implore any young musician, when you're done with your songs, don't just look at them as, oh, there's just 10 songs or 12 songs or however much you have for an album, or just 4 or 5 songs for an EP or whatever. Really look at them and say, where does this go? Look at it like a puzzle. Like Bryan said, where would this song fit better? Would this be better as an opening song? Would this be better in the middle? Would this be better at the end? Would this be better before the last song? You really need to look at it from that perspective. Because again, it's not just the songs that you've written. It's how you want them represented and how you want the songs to represent you.
Coming from a psychological standpoint too, I learned this in my music theory classes in college. The brain responds to tension and release.
Yes.
So when you're doing a chord progression, you want that 5/7 chord in there to resolve on the right chord and all that kind of stuff. The same thing goes with an album when you're sequencing the songs. You want to start off and then maybe give it a little bit of tension, but then your brain can't handle that much tension. So then release that tension. The brain responds the best to tension and release in anything. So why not music as well, and planning your track listing?
There are some young bands that will put so much emphasis and work into their set lists. Mm-hmm. But then when it comes to recording albums, like, oh, whatever, however it goes. And it's like, you should put just as much emphasis into that as you do your set list. Because think of the set list. You want to start off with a strong number, get the crowd up, get them going. Then you want to keep that momentum going. Then maybe you want to cool it off a little bit. Then maybe you want to bring it up again. An album should work the same way.
Yeah, and I know over the years of playing live, I used to plan my sets out that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about energy. The same thing goes with, writing music or writing an album or anything.
But again, it's all about keeping that momentum and just keeping a direction. As long as you're going forward and you're not stalling or you're not going backwards, you've got to keep that momentum. So in this episode, we discussed the process of constructing an album. We talked about flow. We talked about dynamics. We talked about tension and release. And again, I just think it's so important to keep those things in mind when putting together an album or an EP. You've got to keep the listener involved. You can listen to your songs and you know what your songs are. Somebody who's buying your album or hearing your album for the first time doesn't. So again, you need to take them on that journey and you need to keep them engaged. And that's the most important thing about constructing an album. And again, if you have the opportunity as a musician, road test your songs. Play them live first, see which ones work, see which ones don't, see which ones you should hold off on, see which ones need more work. It's really just a lot of trial and error, but the more you could do before you actually get into a studio to record, the better the end result will be, I believe.
Absolutely.
And with that being said, that concludes today's episode of Chords and Conversations. We want to thank you for listening. I'm Chris Hludzik.
And I'm Bryan Brophy.
And we'll talk to you again soon. The Chords and Conversations podcast was conceived and produced by Bryan Brophy and Chris Hludzik and engineered, edited, mixed, and mastered by Chris Hludzik. The Chords and Conversations podcast theme song is an instrumental version of The Powers That Be by The Latter Day from their 2006 album As We Speak and was written by Chris Hludzik, produced and performed by Bryan Brophy and Chris Hludzik, and engineered, mixed, edited, and mastered by Chris Hludzik. All rights to this podcast and its content reserved by Bryan Brophy and Chris Hludzik.